had moved on. The blip was 3 years in the past, and Earth had started to heal from its wounds. People had rebuilt their lives, businesses had reopened, and governments had focused on preventing another catastrophe. But Tony Stark, he felt stuck in time. Sitting alone in his high-rise apartment, he stared at the city below, the glowing skyline of New York reflecting off his whiskey glass. He had everything: wealth, a family, a legacy. But he still felt like a ghost in his own life. The world no longer needed Iron Man. Morgan was growing up, Pepper was busy with the Stark Foundation and the Avengers disbanded, Thor was off-world, Steve was gone, Natasha was gone, and Bruce had retreated into his lab. Tony had always lived for the fight. Now, there was nothing left to fight for. That was when he saw it. A red envelope on his desk. He didn't remember putting it there. He hadn't heard the door open. Inside was a single card, a phone number, and a message. "Do you want to play a game?" Tony's jaw tightened. His first instinct was to dismiss it as a prank, but something about it felt off. He had a choice: walk away, ignore it, go back to his empty routine, or call. Against his better judgment, he called. The next thing Tony knew, he was waking up in a room full of strangers. His head pounded, his body felt heavy. His instincts kicked in immediately. Someone had drugged him. The walls were pale green, industrial, almost clinical. The fluorescent lights above flickered slightly, casting eerie shadows across the room. Hundreds of people in green tracksuits, each labeled with a number, murmured in confusion. Tony sat up, blinking rapidly. His usual sharpness took over. He studied the room, the faces, the exits. He noticed hidden cameras in the corners. That's when the whispers started. Holy shit. Is that Tony Stark? No way, that can't be him. Iron Man. What the hell is he doing here? Some players backed away from him. Others watched him carefully. Tony ran a hand through his hair, exhaling sharply. Okay, clearly not the Stark Expo. Before he could say anything, a deep, booming voice filled the room. "Welcome, players. The games are about to begin." The massive doors slid open, revealing a blindingly bright outdoor space. It was surreal, like stepping onto the set of a twisted children's show. The floor was artificial sand, the sky an illusion of painted clouds. Tony's eyes landed on the giant robotic doll at the far end. Something about it made his skin crawl. "This is some creepy Willy Wonka bullshit," he muttered. The guards in red jumpsuits lined up along the walls. Their expressionless masks revealed nothing. "You are playing red light, green light." The instructions were simple. Run when it says green light, stop when it says red light. Then the game began. Tony hesitated at first. He wasn't the kind of guy who followed orders, but when the first burst of gunfire rang out, his body reacted instantly. A man collapsed beside him, blood pooling around his lifeless form. Screams erupted, people ran in blind panic. More shots fired. Bodies hit the ground. Tony gritted his teeth. His mind raced. Whoever was running this game wasn't messing around. He analyzed the timing, calculated the safe windows between green light and red light. With precise steps, he moved carefully. Some players stared at him, hoping he had a plan. One of them, a disheveled man with a kind face, Seong Gi-hun, stood frozen nearby. He looked at Tony with a mix of awe and desperation. Tony glanced at him. "Keep your movements small. Watch the doll's head. It has a delay before it scans." Gi-hun nodded slowly. They moved forward together. The gunfire stopped. They crossed the line. And just like that, Tony survived his first game. Back in the dormitory, the tension was suffocating. Tony sat in the corner, ignoring the whispers about him. He could already tell people were divided. Some saw him as a threat. Others wanted him as an ally. A man, Cho Sang-woo, approached him. Tony Stark, the genius, billionaire, playboy, philanthropist. Tony didn't react. You don't belong here, Sang-woo said, sitting down across from him. So why are you... Tony exhaled, rubbing his temple. Wish I knew. Sang-woo studied him, then smirked. Well, whatever brought you here, I'd bet every dollar in that piggy bank that you'll try to break the game before it breaks you. Tony's gaze darkened. He had already been thinking about it. Like in the original Squid Game, the players were given a choice. Continue or vote to end the games. Tony immediately voted to leave. There was no way in hell he was playing another round of this insanity. And so, he was released. Tony woke up in a familiar place, an alleyway in Seoul. His money, his connections, his resources, gone. He tried contacting Pepper, but every attempt failed. His Stark ID didn't work. His credit cards declined. It was like he had been erased from the system. Son of a bitch! As he wandered the city, he realized something terrifying. He wasn't the only former player out there, and all of them were being watched. He spotted a man begging in the streets, one of the players from Red Light, Green Light. His arm was bruised, marked with a strange tattoo. Tony's instincts screamed danger. Then he saw it. A black van parked nearby. The door opened. A red-masked guard stepped out. The beggar tried to run. A silenced gunshot ended his escape. Tony froze. This wasn't just a game. It was a system, a machine. And whoever was behind it wasn't letting anyone go. He had two choices, run or go back in, and end it from the inside. His jaw clenched. All right, assholes, let's play. Tony Stark returned to the Squid Game. Tony sat on the hard, cold floor of the dormitory, his back against the metal frame of the bunk bed, staring at the ceiling as the low hum of murmured conversations filled the air. The weight of what he had just done, choosing to return, settled in his chest like an iron block. He had come back knowing full well what awaited him: death, suffering, and an enemy he couldn't fight with a repulsor blast. His mind screamed at him to devise an escape plan, to build something, to break the system from the inside out. But for now, all he could do was play their game. He needed to survive. The dormitory was different this time. Some faces were missing. Others had hardened, their eyes colder, more resolved. The reality of what they had signed up for was sinking in. People weren't just here to play. They were here to win. And the more games they played, the more they were willing to do anything to make it to the end. Tony noticed the shift immediately. Alliances were forming. Stronger players sizing up the weak. He had seen this before in boardrooms and battlefields alike. This was a war now, not a game. Sitting nearby, Seong Gi-hun and Sebayok shared quiet words, their expressions grim. Tony had grown closer to them in the little time they had spent together, and though he tried not to form attachments, it was impossible. He had always been a social creature, someone who needed to be surrounded by others, someone who thrived in connection. Even here, in this twisted place, that part of him wouldn't die. When the guards announced the next game, Tony inhaled deeply, steeling himself. Whatever it was, he had to outthink it. He didn't have his suit. He didn't have Jarvis. All he had was his mind, and for now, that would have to be enough. The players were led into a massive, open room, bathed in unnatural yellow lighting. The walls were painted with vibrant images of childhood games, but there was something eerie about it, something artificial. At the center of the room were four giant shapes: circle, triangle, star, and umbrella, plastered on the walls. The guards handed out small metal tins, and as Tony lifted the lid, he immediately understood the game. A honeycomb candy sat inside, a thin needle placed beside it. The challenge was simple: carve out the shape without breaking it. Tony exhaled slowly, running calculations in his head. The material was fragile, the surface tension of the sugar was unpredictable, and even the smallest miscalculation could cause a crack. He had worked with far more delicate materials, arc reactors, nanotech, even delicate wiring on billion-dollar suits, but this was primal. A caveman's version of precision work, where the only thing at stake wasn't money or progress. It was his life. Glancing at the players around him, he quickly spotted the differences in their expressions. Some had chosen easier shapes. The circles and triangles were already making progress, but others, including Seong Gi-hun, had the dreaded umbrella. Tony's own shape, the star. Not the worst, but far from ideal. His hands moved instinctively, carefully tracing the edges, using his breath to slightly melt the candy, softening the edges. His heart pounded with every crackle of sugar. He could hear gunshots in the distance, one by one, players failing and paying the price. The tension in the room was suffocating, each breath feeling heavier than the last. He finished with seconds to spare. As he placed the completed shape on the tray, a smirk tugged at his lips, but there was no real triumph in it. He turned his attention to Gi-hun, watching as the man desperately licked the back of the candy, trying to weaken the edges. Tony's brows lifted slightly. Not bad. Crude, but effective. The moment the timer ran out, another round of gunfire echoed through the room. The sound of bodies dropping, the quiet gasps of those who had barely made it. The survivors were herded back into the dormitory like cattle. No celebration, no break, just the grim realization that they had simply earned the right to live for a few more hours. Tony had seen fear before, in the eyes of soldiers, in the faces of people watching their cities burn. But this was different. As the lights shut off and the dormitory was plunged into darkness, he heard the first scream, then another, then chaos. He had expected this. No rules, no order, just survival. Somewhere in the darkness, men with sharpened metal shards from broken bed frames moved like predators. Tony stayed low, his mind racing. He needed a plan, needed a weapon, something. Sae-byeok's voice cut through the chaos, urgent, commanding. Stay close. Tony didn't hesitate. He moved toward her and Gi-hun, keeping his back against the bunk as shadows darted past him. A body slammed against the bed frame above, a sickening gurgle following soon after. He could smell blood in the air. He had never felt more powerless. As the guards eventually turned the lights back on, revealing the carnage, Tony knew one thing for certain. This wasn't just a game anymore, it was war. When the next game was revealed, Tony wasn't surprised. Tug of war, a classic test of strength, which meant on the surface it was a game he was destined to lose. But that was the thing about people who only saw power in brute force. They never considered the value of intelligence. His team was a ragtag group: Gi-hun, Sae-byeok, Sang-woo, and a handful of others, some strong, some weak. Across from them, a team of pure muscle. They were already celebrating their inevitable victory. Tony cracked his neck, rolling his shoulders. They had no idea what was coming. He turned to his team, his voice steady, confident. Physics is on our side if we play this right, trust me. They followed his lead. The key wasn't brute force, it was control. Tony had them position their feet at an angle, dig their heels into the ground, and lean back at synchronized intervals. Every time the opposing team pulled, they resisted just enough, but never all at once. The opposing team grew frustrated, started pulling harder. That's when Tony shouted, "Now sidestep and yank." His team moved as one, shifting their weight to the side just as the other team exerted all their energy into pulling forward. The shift in momentum was instantaneous. The enemy team stumbled, one foot slipped, then another, and then they were gone. The screams were short-lived. Tony turned away as their bodies crashed into the abyss. Another game survived. Another step closer to ending this nightmare. The air was heavy. This game felt different. As soon as Tony was handed a bag of marbles, he understood why. They had to pair up. Gi-hun chose him immediately. Tony stared at the small glass spheres in his hand, turning them over with his fingers, his mind racing. There was a way out of this. There had to be. Then he saw the look in Gi-hun's eyes. Resignation, acceptance. Tony, Gi-hun said, his voice soft. I need you to make it out of here. Tony's breath hitched. No, not like this. Gi-hun smiled, pressing his marbles into Tony's hand. I lost. The gunshot rang out before Tony could stop it, and just like that, his only friend was gone. He sat alone that night, his hands clenched into fists. This was never about money. It never had been. This was about control, power, sadistic entertainment. He wasn't just here to survive anymore. He was here to end the game. No matter the cost, Tony Stark sat alone on the cold metal floor of the dormitory, staring down at the bag of marbles still clutched in his hand. The weight of it felt unbearable, heavier than any Iron Man suit he had ever built. The game had taken Gi-hun from him, just like that. No grand sacrifice, no final battle, just a single gunshot, an instant, and his friend was gone. His mind raced, cycling through the endless failures of his past, the people he had lost. Yinsen, Steve, Natasha, Vision, and now Gi-hun. He clenched his jaw, his fingers curling tighter around the bag. This wasn't a game anymore. It had never been. It was a machine, a system designed to break people, to strip them down to nothing. And the worst part? It worked. Tony wasn't here just to win. He was here to destroy the system. His eyes flicked to the remaining players. Fewer than 10 left now. Sang-woo sat in the distance, silent, his eyes dark with calculation. Se-byok clutched a wound at her side, her strength fading fast. They were running out of time. His hands loosened. The bag of marbles slipped from his grip, clinking against the floor. The final game was coming, and it was going to be the last game anyone ever played. They were led into a massive, dark room filled with opulence and excess. Gold statues lined the walls, grotesque depictions of people begging, crawling, suffering. The air was thick with expensive cigars and sweat, the sickening blend of wealth and power. The VIPs. Tony had expected something disgusting, but this was worse. Rich men in elaborate masks lounged on extravagant couches, watching the survivors with sick fascination. They placed bets between sips of champagne, whispering and laughing like this was some high-stakes poker game. One of them, a man in a lion mask, gestured toward Tony and chuckled. Now this is interesting. The great Tony Stark reduced to this, oh, I'll bet a fortune on him. Tony's blood boiled. Se-byok's fingers twitched beside him. She was barely standing. Tony exhaled, forcing himself to stay calm. Not yet. Not here. He let the VIPs gawk at him, let them place their bets. They thought they controlled everything. They were wrong. The remaining players were led onto the final battleground. A large, sand-filled arena, rain pouring down in heavy sheets, soaking their tattered jumpsuits. The guards stood in perfect formation along the perimeter, silent as ever. The frontman stepped forward, his masked face unreadable. The final game is simple. Squid Game, 2 players, 1 winner. Tony already knew what was coming. Sang-woo stepped onto the field. Of course it was him. Tony squared his shoulders, rolling his neck, feeling exhaustion settle deep in his bones. Sang-woo was desperate. He had been fighting from the moment they got here, clawing his way to the top. But desperation didn't beat strategy. Tony had been fighting his whole life. The game began. Sang-woo lunged first, a knife flashing in his grip. Tony barely dodged in time, the blade slicing just past his ribs. He had no weapon, no armor, just his instincts. Sang-woo came at him again, relentless. Tony took the hit, feeling the impact rattle his bones. But he had been in worse fights. He used Sang-woo's momentum, twisting their bodies, slamming the other man into the wet ground. Sang-woo coughed, his grip on the knife loosening. Tony grabbed it and pressed the blade against his opponent's throat. Sang-woo stilled, his breath ragged. The arena was silent. Tony could end it, one move. But he didn't. He dropped the knife. He had killed enough people. The guards tensed, waiting. Tony stood over Sang-woo, his voice calm but firm. "You don't have to do this." Sang-woo's jaw clenched. His eyes flickered, pain, anger, resignation. Then, without hesitation, he plunged the knife into his own chest. Tony's breath caught as he watched the life fade from Sang-woo's eyes. He had won, but he felt no victory. Tony was led back inside. Everything felt muted. The gold piggy bank above them filled with money. The frontman approached, his voice mechanical, devoid of empathy. "Congratulations, player 218. You are the winner." Tony didn't react. The frontman continued. "You may now claim your prize." Tony stared at the vast sum of money. It meant nothing, but there was one last thing to do. The moment Tony was escorted back to the VIP lounge, he made his move. He lunged at the nearest masked VIP, ripping the earpiece from their headset before the guards could react. "Friday, are you there?" he whispered, knowing it was a long shot. For a second, there was silence. Then, "Sir?" Tony's heart skipped a beat. He had hacked into their systems earlier in the games, leaving behind a hidden signal. It had been weak, unstable, but it was enough. It had worked. Within seconds, the entire facility went haywire. Doors locked, power flickered, alarms blared. The VIPs panicked, their carefully controlled playground collapsing around them. Tony grabbed Se-byok, half carrying her toward the nearest exit. The guards turned on each other, confused. The system was crashing. The frontman barked orders, but the chaos was spreading too fast. Tony reached the security room, overriding their systems, broadcasting the footage of the games to the outside world. Everything. The killings, the torture, the VIPs. It was all exposed. By the time he stumbled out of the facility, rain hitting his face, he could hear the distant sounds of sirens, police, helicopters, the real world, finally seeing the truth. The Squid Game was over. Tony sat in a quiet hospital room, staring at the television. News reports flooded every channel. The world was in shock. Investigations were underway. Arrests had already begun. Se-byok was in the next room, alive, healing. The world was moving forward, but Tony, he wasn't done yet. His fingers drummed against the hospital bed, his mind already racing. This wasn't the only game. There were more. He had destroyed one facility, but he knew how systems worked. Cut off one head, and another took its place. This wasn't over. Not until every last one of these games was burned to the ground. He exhaled, closing his eyes for a moment, before opening them again, filled with determination. It was time to end them all.